The City on Seven Hills, From Legend to Republic. The wind that swept across the plains of Latium was a constant whisper of history, centuries before Rome was a name, before the world felt the crushing weight of its legions. The Tiber River, a sluggish brown serpent, carved its path through a landscape of low hills. 7 of them, Palatine, Capitoline, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, Caerleon, and Aventine, rose like the knuckles of a giant hand, future seats of an empire, but at this prehistoric moment, merely isolated, scrub-covered refuges for shepherds and scattered, hard-scrabble villages. This is where the story begins, not with a Senate decree or a triumphant army, but with legend, the powerful blood-soaked mythology that Romans chose to believe, for it spoke directly to their soul. A destiny of conflict, survival, and supreme dominion. The foundational blood, Romulus and Remus. The tale of the twins, Romulus and Remus, was the very bedrock of Roman identity. Their lineage was divine, a claim to greatness few mortals could rival. Born to the Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia and the war god Mars himself, they were instantly perceived as a threat by the wicked king Amulius. He ordered the infants to be drowned in the Tiber, but fate, or perhaps Mars his own hand, guided their basket to shallow water beneath a sacred fig tree at the base of the Palatine Hill. Here, in a moment that would define the city's character forever, they were saved by the most unlikely of mothers, a she-wolf, Lupa. She suckled them in her cave, the Lupercal, her primal ferocity transferring from beast to child. The twins were then discovered by a humble shepherd, Faustulus, and raised in ignorance of their royal blood. This shared upbringing with the common folk, out in the fields, hardened by the elements, became the apotheosis of the common man, a theme that would resonate deeply through the Republic and beyond. Rome was to be a city of action, not mere aristocracy. When the twins finally learned the truth of their heritage, their response was pure Roman, swift, decisive violence. They killed Amulius, restored their grandfather Numitor to the throne of their ancestral city, Alba Longa, and then, driven by an ambition too grand for a salvaged kingdom, chose to found their own city where they had been saved. The fateful choice of location fractured their brotherhood. Romulus favored the Palatine Hill, the sun-drenched, naturally fortified refuge. Remus preferred the Aventine, perhaps more accessible, more spacious. They turned to augury, the reading of signs from the gods through the flight of birds. Remus saw 6 vultures first, but Romulus countered with 12. The disagreement, priority versus quantity, escalated from a debate into a deadly confrontation. The founding of Rome was sealed not with a blessing, but with a fratricide. As Romulus plowed the sacred furrow for his city's walls on the Palatine Hill, Remus, in a gesture of ultimate contempt, leapt scornfully over the half-built rampart. "So perish all who dare to cross my walls," Romulus is said to have declared before striking his twin dead. The city of Rome, named for its sole founder, was stained with blood from its first moment. This was the dark prophecy that shadowed its history, a state constantly battling its own inner divisions and the necessity of brutal, decisive force. The city would always devour its own to survive. The kingdom and the new populace. Romulus, now king, faced an immediate, profound problem. His magnificent new city was empty. It was a fortress without an army, a wall without a population. He solved this with radical pragmatism, declaring Rome an asylum. Fugitives, exiles, runaway slaves, debtors, and ambitious men from neighboring states all were welcome. The message was clear. In Rome, your past did not matter. Only your ambition and loyalty counted. This was Rome's first, most vital, and most enduring innovation, a willingness to integrate, to absorb and to grant citizenship to outsiders, transforming enemies into allies and allies into Romans. But men require families. Romulus's envoys were rebuffed by the proud established neighbors. Thus came the next famous brutal legend, the rape of the Sabine women. Romulus organized a lavish festival for the god Consus and invited the nearby Sabines. On a prearranged signal, the Romans seized the Sabine women, forcing them into marriage. The ensuing war was inevitable. The Sabines marched on Rome, and the conflict reached its climax in the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills. Yet the Sabine women, now Roman wives and mothers, rushed onto the battlefield, their hair disheveled, their faces streaked with tears, placing themselves between their fathers and their husbands. Their plea was for peace, a choice between loss and utter destruction. Their courage worked a miracle. The two peoples joined, forming a single, unified entity, the Roman people. The Sabine king Titus Tatius became Romulus's co-ruler. The legendary history showed that Rome's strength was not just in its walls or its men, but in its unique ability to blend cultures and peoples into a unified, powerful whole. The next 2 centuries saw a succession of 7 kings, a mix of Latin, Sabine, and finally, Etruscan rulers. The Etruscans, a highly sophisticated, technologically advanced civilization from the north, had a profound impact. They drained the marshy Forum Valley, creating the Forum Romanum, the political and commercial heart of the city. They erected the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, a foundational piece of engineering that spoke to Rome's future mastery of concrete and infrastructure. They erected the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, a defiant statement of Rome's permanence and divine protection. The little cluster of hill villages was now indisputably a city. The tyrant and the birth of liberty. The 7th and final king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, was everything the Romans would learn to despise. A self-serving tyrant, he was not elected, but had seized the throne through murder and held it through terror. He dismissed the Senate, ruled by decree, and demanded forced labor for his grand projects, ignoring the most sacred Roman principle, respect for the law, mos maiorum.
The breaking point was not a political revolt, but a personal tragedy. The rape of a noble Roman matron, Lucretia, by Tarquin's son, Sextus. Lucretia, consumed by shame, but determined to prevent her fate from becoming an excuse for tyranny, gathered her father, her husband Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, and the great patriot Lucius Junius Brutus. She told them the horrific truth, and, despite their pleas, took her own life with a dagger. Her dying wish was for vengeance. Brutus, a man who had long feigned dull-wittedness to escape the king's suspicion, pulled the dagger from her wound and swore an oath over the bloody corpse. His words were a thunderclap. "Never again shall a king rule Rome." This was the true birth of the Roman Republic in 509 BC. The story of Lucretia became a foundational myth of Roman liberty and virtue. The Romans realized that a king, no matter how benevolent, represented a single, unpredictable will that could extinguish all freedom. The people, galvanized by the image of Lucretia's virtuous suicide and Brutus's fiery oratory, rose up. The Senate voted for the deposition of the king, and the Tarquins were expelled from Rome forever. The Republican ideal, the struggle for balance. The challenge now was monumental: how to govern a nascent city-state without a king. The solution was to replace a king's singular perpetual power with a collegial, annual, and highly accountable magistracy. They created the office of consul. 2 consuls, elected yearly, would hold equal power, imperium, with each having the right of veto over the other, a brilliant, built-in check against one-man rule. The Republic was thus a fragile creation of checks and balances, an experiment in shared governance, but it was immediately unbalanced. Real power remained concentrated in the hands of the patricians, the wealthy, ancient noble families who traced their lineage to Romulus's original senators, patres. The vast majority of citizens, the plebeians, commoners, farmers, artisans, held no real political power, even as they filled the ranks of the Republic's rapidly growing army. This imbalance led to the struggle of the orders, a century-long, internal, non-violent civil war that defined the young Republic. The plebeians, often simply staging a secessio, a walkout strike to a nearby hill outside the city, demanded rights. They refused to fight Rome's enemies until their demands were met. Their demands led to a series of groundbreaking concessions. The tribunate, the creation of tribunes of the plebes, 10 elected officials who were sacrosanct, inviolable, and possessed the power to veto any act by a magistrate that harmed a plebeian. This was the ultimate popular check on patrician power. The 12 tables, c. 450 BC, the codification of Roman law, written and displayed publicly in the Forum. For the first time, law was accessible to all, not just a secret weapon of the patrician magistrates. It established the principle that all free male citizens were equal under the law. By successfully navigating this internal struggle, Rome achieved something truly unique. A state built not on monolithic power, but on compromise and the continuous, organic expansion of rights. The Republic was not a democracy, but a complex, often messy mix of monarchy, consuls, aristocracy, senate, and popular will, assemblies and tribunes. It was this unique political architecture, firm in its laws, flexible in its concessions, and constantly demanding the participation of its citizens, that transformed the city on 7 hills into a precarious settlement, into a power ready to master the Italian peninsula and ultimately the world. The stage for the rise of Rome was set.
Iron discipline and the Punic fury, forging an empire in war. The young Roman Republic, born of patrician ambition and plebeian sacrifice, had wrestled for 2 centuries to master the Italian boot. Against their Etruscan neighbors to the north and the formidable Greek colonies to the south, the Romans honed their fighting doctrine. It was not genius that won these wars, but a grim, unyielding commitment to the battlefield, a spirit known as gravitas, a profound seriousness of purpose, enforced by a drill-ground terror known as iron discipline. Every legionary knew the stakes. Disobedience in the field was met with the fustuarium, a clubbing to death by one's own comrades. But the discipline was tempered by a system of rewards, the corona civica for saving a citizen's life, the simple promise of a share in the spoils. This mix of unrelenting severity and common-sense reward forged the legion, a flexible, resilient, and utterly relentless war machine, superior to the rigid Greek phalanx it replaced. Yet this regional power, this master of central Italy, was about to collide with a power that dwarfed it, Carthage. The first test, mastery of the sea. Carthage, a Phoenician city across the water in North Africa, was the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Her navy dominated trade routes, and her treasury was filled with the wealth of continents. Rome and Carthage were friends in name, rivals in destiny, and when a squabble over the island of Sicily ignited in 264 BC, the First Punic War began. This conflict presented Rome with an immediate, terrifying problem. Rome was a land power. Carthage was a naval behemoth. The first Roman solution was audacious, bordering on madness. They would build a navy from scratch. They captured a grounded Carthaginian warship and, in a feat of astonishing logistical power, replicated it. But ships alone were not enough. The Romans knew they could not match Carthaginian sailing skill. Their genius lay in turning a sea battle into a land battle. They invented the corvus, the crow, a heavy boarding bridge with a huge metal spike. A Roman ship would ram an enemy vessel, drop the corvus to hook into the deck, and legions of Roman soldiers, trained for hand-to-hand combat, not sailing, would swarm across the bridge. It was crude, it was heavy, and it often destabilized the ships in rough seas, but it worked. Rome won the naval war, forced Carthage to surrender Sicily, and emerged, exhausted but victorious, as the master of an overseas province for the first time. The Republic had tested its military flexibility and its iron will. It was ready for its greatest challenge. Hannibal's oath, the Punic fury. The 30 years of strained peace that followed were a mere prelude. Carthage, nursing its wounds, found its vengeful heart in the person of Hannibal Barca, a son of the general who lost the first war. From the age of 9, Hannibal was made to swear an oath by his father Hamilcar to never be a friend of Rome. He lived that oath. Hannibal was not merely a soldier, he was a strategic prodigy. Recognizing that Rome was unconquerable in a prolonged defensive war, he conceived a plan of breathtaking audacity. Take the war directly to the Italian heartland, shattering Rome's network of alliances and forcing the Republic to bleed on its own soil. The Second Punic War began in 218 BC. Hannibal, commanding an army of Libyans, Spaniards, and Gauls, performed one of the most astonishing military feats of all time, the crossing of the Alps. It was a journey of unimaginable hardship. Men and horses perished in avalanches and freezing passes. The famous war elephants, a bizarre and terrifying spectacle for the tribes, struggled against the elements. Hannibal arrived in the Po Valley with perhaps half of his original force, but crucially, his army was intact, hardened, and ready. The initial Roman response was one of confident disdain. They expected to meet him in Spain or Africa. The idea that a foreign army could invade Italy was simply unthinkable. They learned better, and quickly. The crucible of defeat, Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. Hannibal's campaign in Italy was a 30-year symphony of Roman humiliation, each note more agonizing than the last, forever testing the resilience of the Republic. 1. Trebia, 218 BC. Hannibal's cavalry lured the eager Roman consuls into battle on a bitterly cold day, forcing the Romans to cross a freezing river, weakening them before the fight began. A hidden force commanded by his brother Mago ambushed the Roman rear, turning defeat into a rout. Lake Trasimene, 217 BC. The Carthaginian general placed his entire army in a dense fog along a narrow lakeside road. When the Roman columns marched blindly into the trap, Hannibal sprang his ambush. The Romans were slaughtered by the thousands, pressed into the lake, or cut down before they could form battle lines. A consul was killed, and the news sent a wave of panic crashing over Rome. These defeats were devastating, but the Roman Senate, that rock of gravitas, refused to negotiate. Their reaction was typically Roman. They appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius, nicknamed Cunctator, the delayer, adopted a strategy of avoiding direct confrontation, instead harassing Hannibal's supply lines and shadowing his movements. It was unpopular. It looked like cowardice, but it prevented a final, fatal blow. The Roman people, however, wanted decisive action. In 216 BC, they fielded the largest army they had ever assembled, 8 massive legions, perhaps 80,000 men, commanded by 2 consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. They would crush Hannibal at last. The place was Cannae. Hannibal's army was outnumbered, perhaps by 2 to 1, but he was master of the ground and the mind. He drew up his forces in a shallow crescent, weaker in the center, stronger on the flanks with his veteran African troops and powerful Carthaginian cavalry. The Romans, relying on their superior numbers, charged hard into the center, expecting to break through. As the Romans compressed into a dense, struggling mass, Hannibal's center slowly gave way, bending backward until it formed a lethal, inverted crescent. The African troops on the flanks, meanwhile, held firm, then swung inward. The Carthaginian cavalry, having utterly annihilated the Roman horsemen, charged the Roman rear. The 8 Roman legions, the cream of the Republic's manhood, were surrounded, packed so tightly they could barely raise their swords. What followed was a massacre unprecedented in Roman history. Up to 70,000 Roman soldiers were killed in a single day. Rome lost more citizen soldiers at Cannae than any other battle in its entire history. The defeat shattered Roman confidence and caused many southern Italian allies to defect to Hannibal. The phrase, Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal is at the gates, became the ultimate Roman expression of existential dread. The iron will of the Senate. Any other state would have sued for peace. Any other people would have surrendered their gold and bowed to the conqueror. But this was Rome, founded on the principle that defeat was a temporary setback, not a final sentence. The Senate's response to Cannae defined Roman character for the next 1,000 years. They passed no resolutions of panic. They refused to ransom the thousands of surviving prisoners. They would not pay for weakness. Instead, they decreed a massive, brutal effort of mobilization. Every man capable of carrying a weapon was enlisted. Boys, debtors, even slaves, who were promised freedom in exchange for service. The Republic replaced the 70,000 fallen men with new legions. The gates of Rome remained shut to Hannibal, who, lacking the siege engines and manpower necessary to take the mighty city itself, was forced to campaign across the increasingly hostile Italian landscape. The Roman strategy reverted to Fabius's, avoidance. They learned to never again face Hannibal on open ground. They would fight his allies, recapture his gains one city at a time, and starve him of supplies and reinforcements. Rome was effectively blockading the greatest general on earth within its own backyard. The rise of the counter-genius, Scipio Africanus. The true turning point, however, lay not in discipline alone, but in the rise of a general who could match Hannibal's genius, Publius Cornelius Scipio. A survivor of the early defeats, Scipio was a brilliant, charismatic anomaly, a strategist who dared to combine Roman discipline with Carthaginian-style cunning and maneuver. Scipio saw the futility of fighting Hannibal in Italy. His counterplan was magnificent in its audacity. Ignore Hannibal and instead strike at Carthage's power base in Spain. In a brilliant campaign, 210 to 206 BC, Scipio utterly destroyed Carthaginian control of the Iberian Peninsula, capturing their capital, Nova Carthago, and training a new elite army in the process. He learned Hannibal's tactics, the feigned retreat, the pincer movement, the use of auxiliary cavalry, and perfected them. The Senate, though wary of Scipio's near-monarchical popularity, could not deny his success. Scipio proposed the final bold stroke: invade North Africa itself, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy. He landed in Africa in 204 BC, burning the camps of Carthage's allies and forcing the issue. The Carthaginian Senate, its homeland under direct threat, finally sent the message Hannibal had dreaded for 15 years: return home. Zama, the final test of iron. The last great confrontation of the war took place in 202 BC at the Battle of Zama in North Africa. Hannibal, finally on his home soil, fielded an army composed largely of veterans who had campaigned in Italy for years, but also of hastily levied local troops and, crucially, a line of 80 war elephants. Scipio faced him with Roman legions whose discipline was absolute, bolstered by Numidian cavalry led by the treacherous Prince Massinissa, a former ally of Carthage, whom Scipio had won over, a testament to his diplomatic genius. The battle was a duel between the greatest generals of the age, and it became a masterpiece of Roman engineering and tactical adaptation. Hannibal led with his elephants. Scipio, anticipating this, ordered his legions not to stand solid, but to open up lanes in their formation, turning his lines into funnels. As the elephants charged, the Roman trumpets blew a jarring synchronized blast, disorienting the beasts, which were then channeled harmlessly through the lanes. Roman skirmishers finished them off from the flanks. Then the battle devolved into the clash of the main infantry lines. Hannibal's veterans fought with their famed fury, but Scipio's discipline and superior cavalry decided the day. As the infantry ground against each other, the Numidian and Roman cavalry returned from routing the Carthaginian horse, crashing into Hannibal's rear. The result was an annihilation. Hannibal was defeated, his army destroyed. The Roman Republic had won. It had faced an enemy of unparalleled brilliance, endured slaughter that should have broken its spirit, and emerged not only victorious, but utterly transformed. The Punic Wars had cost hundreds of thousands of lives, but they had forged the Roman military into the ultimate fighting force and taught the Republic its most essential lesson: Rome could not be defeated as long as it refused to surrender. The Republic emerged from the Punic fury not as a regional power, but as the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. The path to an empire built on iron discipline was now wide open. Carthage was destroyed decades later in the Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BC. Its territory reduced to a province, its power gone. The fury was extinguished. Only the discipline remained, ready to turn its gaze eastward to Greece and beyond.
Marius's legions. The army becomes a sword for hire. The death of the Gracchi brothers had torn the illusion of political peace from Rome's eyes. The constitution was wounded, its procedures stained with blood. But the most profound change that sealed the Republic's fate came not from a tribune's law, but from a general's desperate need for soldiers. This general was Gaius Marius, a self-made novus homo, new man, from Arpinum, who would unintentionally turn the once sacred army of citizen soldiers into a professional force loyal only to the man who paid them. The crisis of the citizen soldier, circa 110 BC. For centuries, the Roman army had been the bedrock of the Republic, a citizen militia of landowning farmers, assidui. Military service was not a profession, but a civic duty, a right and a temporary obligation to protect one's own land and city. A man served, won glory and spoils, and returned to his farm.
The great wars of conquest against Carthage, in Spain, and in the East had destroyed this model. Campaigns lasted years, not months. The citizen farmer could no longer be away from his land for such long periods without losing it to debt or having it absorbed into a wealthy man's latifundia. As the Gracchi had warned, the pool of propertied men shrank catastrophically. The crisis became an existential threat during the Jugurthine War in Numidia, North Africa, and the later invasions of the Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutones, in the north. The traditional armies sent to fight King Jugurtha were poorly led and often defeated, reflecting the incompetence and corruption of the Senate's aristocratic generals. When Jugurtha humiliated the Republic, the people, tired of senatorial failure, demanded a change. In 107 BC, the Roman people, in a stunning display of popular will, elected Marius, a brilliant but rough soldier from a relatively obscure family, as consul, and gave him command of the war. 2. The Revolutionary Edict, 107 BC. Marius faced an immediate, paralyzing problem. He needed soldiers for a tough, distant campaign, but the census rolls were bare. The pool of eligible assidui was exhausted. He had to win a long, grinding war, but the Republic's centuries-old military system had failed. Marius's solution was simple, practical, and utterly revolutionary. He abolished the property qualification for military service. He issued a call for volunteers, inviting men from the capite censi, the head count, or landless poor, proletari, who had previously been excluded from the legions because they had no property to defend. The response was overwhelming. For the dispossessed masses living in the squalor of Rome's slums, this was salvation. Military service was no longer a temporary civic duty. It was a contract, a paid career that offered regular wages, a share of the plunder, and most critically, the promise of a land grant upon honorable discharge. The nature of the Roman soldier changed overnight. From citizen to professional, the army was no longer a militia. It was a professional, standing force, bound by an oath of service and a contract of reward. From patriotism to patronage, the new soldier did not fight for the Senate, the city, or the Constitution. He fought for the general who recruited him, trained him to victory, and who alone had the power to secure the land and bonuses that were his retirement fund. Loyalty shifted from the Republic to the commander. 3. Forging the professional legion. With his new recruits, Marius transformed the Roman fighting machine from top to bottom, creating the structure that would define Rome's power for the next 4 centuries. 1. Organizational and tactical changes. Marius standardized the legion, replacing the old tiered 3-line system, hastati, principes, and triari, with a single class of heavy infantry, all identically equipped and trained. He replaced the small, fragile menipole with the larger, more cohesive cohort, about 480 men, as the basic tactical unit. A legion now comprised 10 cohorts, offering superior flexibility and striking power on the battlefield. 2. The standardized soldier and the muli mariani. The state now provided all the equipment: sword, gladius, armor, lorica amata or segmentata, and shield, scutum, ensuring uniformity and quality. Marius also earned his soldiers the nickname the Marius's Mules, Muli Mariani. He had them carry their own rations, cooking gear, tools, and the stake for the defensive palisade on a special forked pole, forca, drastically reducing the size of the baggage train and making the army faster, harder, and far more mobile. 3. The sacred eagle. Marius made the aquila, eagle, the sole standard of the legion, replacing the previous assortment of symbols. The eagle became a living god to the men. Losing it in battle was the ultimate disgrace. The eagle solidified the legion's identity and its fierce pride, but it also reinforced the men's sense of belonging to a unit separate from the civilian state. 4. The gift of citizenship. After crushing the Germanic invasions at Aquae Sextiae, 102 BC, and Vercellae, 101 BC, Marius unilaterally granted Roman citizenship to the Italian auxiliary troops who had fought with exceptional bravery. This bold act, a forerunner to the later devastating social war, affirmed that the military, not the Senate, was the ultimate arbiter of who belonged in the Roman state. IV. The unintended legacy, the sword for hire. Marius had solved Rome's immediate military crisis, saving the Republic from foreign annihilation. But in doing so, he had fatally undermined its political structure. The reforms created a fundamental conflict: the Republic's fatal flaw. The Senate, representing the elite, refused to solve the crisis of the professional army's loyalty. They were unwilling to use state funds to buy land for the thousands of retiring veterans, fearing that this would increase the popular power of generals like Marius. This senatorial negligence made the retired legionary's well-being entirely dependent on his commander. The general became the patron, the army his clients. The bond was no longer abstract patriotism, but a concrete transactional loyalty. The general secures our future, we secure his power. The generals now possessed a new, devastating political tool: a private army ready to follow them against the Republic's own laws. The first cracks. The true potential of this private army was first shown in the bitter rivalry between Marius and his former quaestor, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. In 88 BC, Sulla, a proud aristocrat, was legally given command of a war in the east. Marius, jealous and ambitious, used a sympathetic tribune to have the command transferred to himself by a vote of the People's Assembly.
Caesar
The
knew
legal
that to lay
transfer
down
was
his
met with an
command was to sign
unprecedented
his
act.
own death warrant.
Sulla marched his legions
3.
on Rome.
The point of no return, late 50 BC to January 49 BC. The Senate, led by the steadfastly Republican Cato the Younger, demanded that Caesar disband his army immediately. Caesar offered a compromise. He would give up most of his legions and only retain his governorship of Cisalpine Gaul and 1 legion until he could legally stand for the consulship in absentia without entering Rome. Pompey and the Optimates refused. They believed the Republic would never be safe with Caesar and his veterans retaining any power. They countered with a definitive, uncompromising ultimatum: Caesar must disband his army by a set date or be declared an enemy of the state. Caesar's only remaining legal avenue lay with the tribunes of the plebs, the office historically established to protect the people from the Senate. 2 of his staunchest allies, Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, and Quintus Cassius Longinus, used their tribunician veto to block the Senate's ultimatum. In a final, desperate act, the Senate issued the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the ultimate decree, declaring martial law, effectively suspending the tribune's sancto sanctity, and empowering the consuls to see that the Republic suffer no harm. Antony and Cassius, fearing the same fate that had met the Gracchi, fled Rome under the cover of night, seeking refuge with their general. The flight of the tribunes was the signal. The constitutional game was over. The Republic had officially declared war on its own greatest general. 4. The dice are cast. January 10th, 11th, 49 BC. Caesar was at Ravenna, just north of the Rubicon River, a tiny, unremarkable stream that served as the legal boundary between his province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italia proper. No Roman general was permitted to cross this line with an army under arms. To do so was maiesta, treason against the state. On the night of January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar gathered the single legion he had with him, the famous Legio 13 Gemina. The moment was heavy with destiny, a silent confrontation between a man and the Republic he was about to destroy in order to save himself.
According to later accounts, Caesar paused by the riverbank, staring into the dark waters, his mind reeling from the enormity of the decision. He was gambling not just his life, but the political future of the entire Roman world. He turned to his officers and uttered the phrase that would echo through history: "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. He led the 13th Legion across the Rubicon. The act was irrevocable. The civil war had begun. 5. The Republic's final gasp. The crossing was not a glorious battle. It was a silent, decisive march. But the shockwave that struck Rome was immediate and devastating. The Senate and Pompey, believing that Caesar's force was still in Gaul, were caught completely unprepared. They had relied on the majesty of the law to restrain him, forgetting that Marius's reforms had made the army a personal tool. The speed of Caesar's advance, his signature military trait, broke all resistance. Panic in Rome. The senators, including Pompey, fled the city in utter panic, abandoning the treasury and the state archives, believing Caesar was marching on Rome to butcher them all in a repeat of Sulla's bloody proscriptions. The people's loyalty. Caesar marched south not as a foreign invader, but as the champion of the populares. The Italian towns, tired of the Senate's corruption and mismanagement, opened their gates to him, welcoming his legions as liberators. The expected resistance failed to materialize. Pompey's retreat. Pompey, realizing that Italy was lost, orchestrated the Brundisium evacuation, ferrying the Senate, the consuls, and his remaining legions across the Adriatic Sea to Greece, intending to rally the vast resources of the East for a counterattack. Within 60 days of crossing the Rubicon, Caesar was master of all Italy without having fought a single major battle. The Republic's institutions were scattered across the sea, its laws silenced by the tramp of legionary boots. The ensuing civil war, 49 to 45 BC, would rage across the Mediterranean, culminating in Caesar's decisive victory over Pompey's much larger but less cohesive forces at the Battle of Pharsalus, 48 BC. Though Pompey was later assassinated in Egypt, Caesar pursued and crushed the remaining Republican holdouts in Africa and Spain. Caesar returned to Rome as its undisputed master, holding the title Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. He had not abolished the Republic, he had simply revealed that it no longer existed in reality. The foundations, cracked by the Gracchi and undermined by Marius, had finally crumbled under the immense weight of one man's personal ambition and the absolute loyalty of his professional army. The crossing of the Rubicon was not the birth of the empire, but the moment the breath left the body of the ancient Roman Republic. The sword had finally mastered the law. The Lion and the Serpent, Actium and the Birth of the Empire. The assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC was the final desperate spasm of the dying Roman Republic. The conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, believed they were restoring liberty. In reality, they merely accelerated the Republic's demise, setting the stage for the ultimate clash between two of Caesar's heirs, the political genius Octavian and the seasoned soldier Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, intertwined with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra VII. This final conflict, the War of Actium, would determine not who ruled the Republic, but who would be the sole ruler of the new Roman world. 1. The Inheritance and the Partnership, 44 to 42 BC. The immediate aftermath of Caesar's murder saw Rome plunge back into chaos. Antony, Caesar's experienced lieutenant, attempted to seize power, only to be challenged by a surprising figure, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew and adopted son, who returned from Apollonia, claimed his inheritance, and renamed himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Antony, the Lion, was a charismatic, battle-hardened man of 40, admired by the legions. Octavian, the Serpent, was physically frail, but possessed a chilling, ruthless political mind far beyond his years. Faced with a resurgent Republican army led by Brutus and Cassius, the two rivals did the politically necessary. They allied with the loyal general Marcus Aemilius Lepidus to form the Second Triumvirate, 43 BC. Their first act was a bloody one, the proscriptions, a campaign of legal murder designed to eliminate their political enemies and seize their wealth to fund their war. Having secured their rear, the triumvirs marched east and decisively defeated the Republicans at the Battle of Philippi, 42 BC, effectively erasing the last champions of the old republic. 2. The division of the world, 42 to 33 BC. After Philippi, the Roman world was carved up. Lepidus was given Africa and soon marginalized. Octavian took the west, Italy, Gaul, and Spain, the core of Roman power and the source of new legions. His task was to settle the veterans and restore order, a political nightmare he handled with brutal efficiency, solidifying his control of the city of Rome and the loyalty of the Western legions. Antony took the east, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and the rich client kingdom of Egypt. His mission was to wage war against the Parthians, Rome's perennial enemy, and reorganize the wealthy eastern provinces. It was in the east that Antony met Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the woman who had captivated Julius Caesar. Cleopatra, the Serpent Queen, ruled a Hellenistic kingdom rich with grain and gold. She saw Antony not just as a lover, but as a strategic asset, a man whose military might could protect her ancient dynasty from Roman encroachment. Antony, in turn, found in Alexandria the resources, comfort, and intellectual society that contrasted sharply with the rough life of a Roman general. Antony's entanglement with Cleopatra became Octavian's most potent political weapon. 3. The War of Propaganda, 33 to 32 BC. As the years passed, the fissure between the two triumvirates widened. Antony's focus shifted increasingly to the east. He married Octavian's sister, Octavia, in a political move, but soon abandoned her, returning to Alexandria and Cleopatra. The political fuse was lit by Antony's donations of Alexandria, 34 BC. In a lavish, overtly Hellenistic ceremony, Antony publicly declared Cleopatra's children to be the rulers of vast swaths of Roman-controlled territory in the east. He legitimized his own son with Cleopatra, Ptolemy Caesarion, as the true son of Julius Caesar. Octavian's propaganda machine in Rome worked flawlessly, painting a devastating portrait of his rival. The traitor and the puppet, Antony was no longer a Roman statesman, but a treasonous drunken fool, spellbound by the Egyptian whore who intended to move the capital to Alexandria and enslave Rome to a foreign queen. The clash of civilizations. This was not a civil war, Octavian asserted, but a war for the soul of Rome. The vigorous, disciplined West versus the decadent, corrupt, and foreign East. Octavian positioned himself as the savior of Roman tradition, the pious, dutiful heir of Caesar. In 32 BC, the Senate, now purged of Antony's supporters and intimidated by Octavian, formally stripped Antony of his command and declared war on Cleopatra, not Antony, to maintain the legal fiction that Rome was not fighting a civil war. The stage was set for the final bloody showdown.
5. Actium, the end of an era. September 2nd, 31 BC. On the morning of September 2, 31 BC, the two fleets sailed out of the bay. The wind was low, the sea calm. The battle was a slow, grinding affair. Antony's gigantic ships with their thick hulls resisted ramming and were difficult to board.
But Agrippa's Liburnians moved like bees around the lumbering giants, striking at the oars and rudders, eventually isolating and incapacitating the larger vessels one by one. At the height of the engagement, the unthinkable happened. Cleopatra, on her magnificent royal barge, took advantage of a sudden favorable wind and, along with 60 of her best ships, broke through the lines and sailed south, heading for Egypt. Antony, seeing the Queen's scarlet sails disappearing over the horizon and sensing that all was lost, his power, his resources, and the woman for whom he had risked everything, abandoned his flagship and followed her. He chose the serpent over the lion. He chose love and flight over duty and death. The effect on Antony's remaining forces was catastrophic. The sight of their commander fleeing the field of battle shattered their will. The remaining ships, deprived of leadership, fought valiantly for a time before surrendering or being destroyed. The land army, now isolated and leaderless, held out for a week before defecting en masse to Octavian. 6. The birth of the empire, 31 BC onwards. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC did more than just settle a political rivalry. It ended a century of civil war that had bled the Roman world dry. The victor, the 21-year-old Gaius Octavian, returned to Rome not as a conqueror, but as a deliverer. Yet the question loomed: how could one man seize absolute control of a state founded on the principle of shared power without provoking the daggers that had felled his adopted father, Julius Caesar? The answer was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was a masterpiece of political deception and administrative genius, a brilliant bargain that traded the abstract, violent notion of republican libertas for the tangible, prosperous reality of imperial pax, peace. Octavian, later Augustus, would spend the next 40 years of his life crafting this golden age of stability, and in doing so, he transformed the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. 1. The mask of republicanism. Octavian becomes Augustus, 31-27 BC. Octavian understood a crucial lesson from Caesar's assassination. Autocracy must be cloaked in tradition. The Roman elite were not ready for a king. They were only ready for a first citizen. For 3 years after Actium, Octavian consolidated his military command, settling his legions and ensuring their unwavering loyalty. Then in 27 BC, he performed his great political theater, the first constitutional settlement. He appeared before the Senate and, with a magnanimous gesture that fueled few but satisfied all, he returned the state to the Senate and the Roman people. He offered to lay down his supreme emergency powers. The Senate, purged of his enemies and filled with his clients, immediately gave him back his authority, but with new, respectable names. He was granted the provinces of Spain, Gaul, and Syria, the provinces that housed the vast majority of the Roman army. He thus remained commander-in-chief, imperator, without holding the old, divisive title of dictator. He was given the revered, semi-religious name, Augustus, the Exalted One. This settlement birthed the Principate, the name for the new government. Augustus was the princeps, the first citizen, who merely advised the Senate. In reality, he controlled all the levers of power: the military, the provincial governorships, the treasury, and the ultimate auctoritas, prestige, influence, over every magistrate in the state. The Republic was dead, but its body was so beautifully embalmed that no one dared to point out the corpse. The Pax Romana was not merely the absence of war. It was the presence of highly organized, centralized governance. Augustus dedicated himself to securing and rationalizing the enormous empire. He created a professional, standing army of 28 permanent legions, around 300,000 men, ensuring they received regular pay and, most crucially, large land grants upon retirement. This ended the cycle of private armies led by self-serving generals. He positioned these legions permanently along the newly established and heavily fortified frontiers, the Rhine, the Danube, and the Euphrates. The policy was consolidation, not conquest. The empire's heartland could now focus on commerce, protected by a disciplined military shield. The stability guaranteed by the legions allowed for an unparalleled economic boom. Augustus built and maintained the vast network of Roman roads, paths of power that linked every corner of the empire. He introduced the cursus publicus, the official relay system for messages and state officials. He introduced a common, stable currency and ruthlessly purged the Mediterranean of the pirates that had plagued trade for centuries, making the Mare Nostrum, our sea, truly Roman and safe for commerce. Augustus famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He initiated massive public works, new temples, basilicas, and, most vital for the plebeians, aqueducts to secure the water supply. He created Rome's first formal police force, cohortes urbanae, and a professional fire brigade, vigiles, bringing safety and order to the chaotic streets. For the populace, the tangible benefits of his rule, safety, water, and grain, were a small price to pay for the loss of a distant, quarrelsome Senate. Augustus understood that stability required more than just walls and roads. It required a spiritual and moral renewal to counter the licentiousness and individualism that had characterized the Republic's last century. He sought to revive the old Roman virtues of piety, duty, and marital fidelity. He passed a series of moral laws, the Lex Julia and Lex Poppaea, making adultery a public crime and encouraging marriage and higher birth rates among the depleted senatorial class. He positioned himself as the chief religious authority, the Pontifex Maximus. He restored 82 dilapidated temples and patronized the imperial cult, allowing the veneration of his genius, spirit, and that of the deified Julius Caesar. This created a new unifying religious identity centered on the emperor. The golden age of literature. With the emperor as a generous patron, writers flourished. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, an epic that gave Rome a mythical founding hero, Aeneas, and glorified Augustus's own destiny. Horace penned odes celebrating the new peace, and Livy wrote his monumental history, glorifying the Republic's past to instruct the empire's future. This era of artistic and intellectual flowering became known as the Augustan Age. Augustus reigned for 41 years until his death in AD 14. His life's work was the creation of a system, the Principate, that made his power institutional and hereditary. He had avoided the mistake of the dictator Caesar and ensured that the transition of power would be smooth. He adopted and groomed his stepson Tiberius, establishing the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The period of the Pax Romana is formally dated from Augustus's ascension in 27 BC to the death of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius in AD 180, a span of over 2 centuries. This was an age in which internal strife was minimal. Though there were border skirmishes and occasional provincial revolts, the vast interior of the empire enjoyed unprecedented security and predictability. Urbanization flourished. Cities across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East grew, becoming centers of Roman law, language, Latin in the West, Greek in the East, and culture. Prosperity was widespread. the peace and order generated a robust, integrated market economy where goods, people, and ideas flowed from Britain to Egypt. The Pax Romana was, in essence, the ultimate exchange. The volatile, unpredictable freedom of the Republic was traded for the safe, prosperous servitude of the empire. Augustus, the subtle architect, gave the Romans what they desired most after a century of bloodshed: stability, and in the process gave birth to one of the most enduring political structures in world history. His final words, as recorded by Suetonius, are said to have been, "Have I played the part well, then applaud as I exit," a fitting self-assessment from the master actor who had staged the end of the Republic and the dawn of a golden age.
The madmen and the philosophers, Nero, Trajan, and the imperial dynasty. The Roman Empire, birthed from the calculated ambition of Augustus, was a sublime paradox. It was a vast, orderly machine that guaranteed the Pax Romana, yet its operation was subject to the whims and DNA of a single, all-powerful man. The span from the first dynasty to the age of the philosopher-emperors is a searing portrait of this truth, charting the empire's roller coaster ride between the depths of depraved tyranny and the heights of enlightened governance. It is the story of the madman, Nero and his kin, and the philosophers, Trajan and his successors. I. The Tragedy of Blood. The Julio-Claudians and the Artist Emperor. The first dynasty, the Julio-Claudians, 27 BC to AD 68, was a glorious failure. Starting with the genius of Augustus and the pragmatism of Tiberius, the line gradually succumbed to the corrosive effects of inherited, unchecked power. It was a dynasty of brilliant founders and subsequent degenerates, culminating in the figure of Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Nero inherited the purple in AD 54 at the age of 17. The early years of his reign, known as the Quinquennium Neronis, were guided by his Stoic tutor, Seneca the Younger, and the Praetorian prefect, Burrus. This brief period was marked by reasonable administration, reduced taxes, and respect for the Senate, a testament to the enduring structures of the Augustan Principate. But Nero was not born to rule. He was born to perform. He saw himself not as the head of the world's most powerful military state, but as a divine artiste. As he matured, his impulses, his true passions for music, drama, and chariot racing began to clash violently with the demands of his office. The philosopher Seneca's restraint proved no match for the emperor's megalomania. The descent was swift and brutal. In quick succession, Nero engineered the murders of his mother, Agrippina the Younger, a dramatic, protracted affair involving a collapsible boat, his stepbrother Britannicus, and his wife Octavia. The philosopher Seneca was dismissed and eventually compelled to commit suicide. The climax of Nero's infamy came with the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64. A devastating blaze consumed much of the city. While contemporary historians suggest Nero was in Antium at the time, the enduring rumor, fueled by his own erratic behavior, was that he ordered the fire himself, perhaps to clear space for his colossal new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. The popular image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned, though he likely played the lyre, cemented his reputation as a madman indifferent to his people's suffering. To deflect the public outcry, Nero scapegoated a small, obscure sect in the city, the Christians, initiating the first systematic, brutal persecution against them. His extravagance and increasingly tyrannical behavior, including performing on stage in Greece, a scandalous humiliation for a Roman emperor, alienated the Senate and the military. By AD 68,
the massive imperial machine could no longer tolerate its driver. Rebellions erupted in the provinces, the Senate declared him a public enemy, and Nero was forced to commit suicide, crying out, "Qualis artifex pereo," or "What an artist dies in me." His death plunged the empire into the first true crisis of succession, the year of the four emperors, AD 69, proving that the republic's disease, succession by civil war, had only been temporarily suppressed. 2. The interlude of merit, the Flavians, and the year of adoption. The year of the four emperors ended with the ascendancy of Vespasian, founder of the Flavian dynasty, AD 69 to 96. Vespasian was a stark contrast to Nero, a blunt, proven general of humble, non-aristocratic origins. The Flavians restored stability, rebuilt Rome, including the mighty Colosseum on the site of Nero's drained lake, and restored the imperial finances. His second son, Domitian, however, eventually drifted back toward the autocracy of the Julio-Claudians, alienating the Senate and ruling with increasing suspicion. His assassination in AD 96 finally shattered the illusion of hereditary dynasty. The Senate, determined to avoid another bloody succession, made a revolutionary choice. They elevated a most unlikely man, Marcus Cosseius Nerva, an elderly, mild-mannered senator. Nerva's brief reign established the most important principle of the imperial Golden Age, succession by merit, not blood. In AD 97, under pressure from the Praetorian Guard, Nerva adopted a successful popular general named Marcus Oppius Trajanus, Trajan, as his son and heir. Trajan, a Roman from Spain, was the first emperor born outside Italy, marking a symbolic opening of the empire's inner circle to its vast provinces.
Welfare and public works. Trajan used the immense wealth seized from Dacia to fund unprecedented public works. In Rome, he built his magnificent Forum of Trajan, arguably the most glorious architectural complex in the city, featuring his celebrated Column of Trajan, which still stands today, depicting his Dacian wars. He also implemented the alimenta, an early form of state-sponsored welfare that provided funds for the support of poor children throughout Italy. The model administrator. Trajan's correspondence with Pliny the Younger, the governor of Bithynia Pontus, provides a clear window into his principled rule. His answers to Pliny's concerns, ranging from how to deal with the Christians to the funding of public baths, are marked by clarity, fairness, and pragmatism. Trajan's response to Pliny's inquiries about Christians was a model of moderation. Do not seek them out, but punish them if they are formally accused and refuse to recant. Trajan's governance was the complete antithesis of Nero's capriciousness. It was rational, systematic, and dedicated to the public good. He was a general who led from the front, a statesman who consulted, and a builder who left a legacy of grandeur and stability. Conclusion: the two faces of the empire. The reigns of Nero and Trajan, the madman and the philosopher, represent the terrifying political spectrum upon which the Roman Empire operated. The Julio-Claudians revealed the inherent weakness of hereditary rule, where the stability of the world hinged on the sanity of one man. Their story is one of internal decay, where the power intended to serve the state was used to serve a single monstrous ego. The age of the good emperors, inaugurated by Nerva and perfected by Trajan, offered a fleeting vision of political perfection, a meritocratic monarchy, where the most capable and virtuous man in the empire, regardless of birth, was selected to rule. The Pax Romana was not peace everywhere, but peace at the heart of the empire. The madmen endangered that heart with their selfish excess. The philosophers secured it with their wisdom, their armies, and their unparalleled administrative competence. Trajan's legacy was not just expansion, but the creation of the Optimus Princeps, the gold standard of an emperor, a figure whose ghost would haunt and inspire every subsequent ruler who dared to sit upon the throne of Rome. The Roman Empire, from its humble origins on the Tiber, defined itself by relentless expansion. Yet the vastness of its conquests, the far shores, forced a continual redefinition of who was a citizen and what constituted the limits of empire. This narrative is the story of how Rome grappled with the geometric challenge of governing an ever-expanding world, a struggle that simultaneously built and eventually strained the greatest political entity of the ancient world. The price of the far shores, conquest and assimilation. The Roman expansion was not a planned blueprint, but a voracious, opportunistic process fueled by the Roman elite's insatiable thirst for glory and the state's need for security. The tools of conquest. The instrument of this ambition was the Roman legion, a professional force of disciplined soldiers capable of adapting to any terrain and any foe. From the dense forests of Gaul to the arid deserts of Syria, the legions were the ultimate agents of Romanization. The West, Gaul and Britain. The conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar in the 50s BC was brutal, but strategically transformative. It secured Rome's northern flank and provided an immense pool of wealth and manpower. Later, the invasion of Britain under Claudius, AD 43, pushed the frontier to a truly far shore, bringing the Roman eagle to the edge of the known world. These western lands were less urbanized and were conquered for land, resources, and prestige. The East, Greece and Asia Minor. In the East, Rome conquered lands already rich in Hellenistic culture and ancient cities. Here, conquest was often cloaked in the language of liberation from oppressive kings. But the true prize was the staggering wealth and sophistication of the Greek world. Rome was less a conqueror, more than an inheritor, absorbing Greek philosophy, literature, and administrative techniques. The province as a Roman world. Once conquered, a territory was organized as a province, governed by a proconsul or legate. The Roman genius lay in administration, not just battle. The Romans brought Roman law, a uniform system of justice that replaced fragmented local customs. Infrastructure, networks of military roads, aqueducts, and magnificent public buildings, urbanization, that physically knit the empire together. Economic integration, a single currency, and the suppression of piracy, which allowed for unprecedented trade. Grain flowed from Egypt, olive oil from Spain, and tin from Britain, all feeding the Roman core. For many provincials, Roman rule, despite its initial violence and heavy taxation, brought a period of stability and economic opportunity unknown under their previous rulers. The evolution of the citizen, from Rome to the world. The critical feature that distinguished the Roman Empire from every other empire before it was its radical, revolutionary approach to citizenship, civitas, a ladder to full integration. In the early Republic, citizenship was a fiercely guarded privilege of the Latin-speaking people of Italy. However, to manage the constant cycle of war and expansion, Rome developed a layered system of integration. Allies, soci. Conquered peoples were often granted limited rights, such as freedom from tribute and the right to trade and marry Romans. Crucially, they were required to provide soldiers to the Roman army. Latin rights. This halfway status granted many privileges of a Roman citizen without the right to vote in Rome. Full citizenship, civitas, the ultimate prize. It meant protection under Roman law, the right to vote, if in Rome, and the right to hold office. It was the ladder through which provincial elites ascended to the highest ranks of power.
This policy transformed enemies into allies and ensured that conquered populations had a vested interest in the survival of the empire. Provincials could now serve in the legions, and after retirement, they and their children would receive citizenship, settling throughout the empire and further spreading Roman identity, Romanization. The Great Decree, the Constitutiano Antoniniana. The pinnacle of this process occurred in AD 212 under Emperor Caracalla. Facing the increasing administrative complexity and a need to broaden the tax base, he issued the Constitutiano Antoniniana, or Edict of Caracalla. This decree granted Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire. The distinction between Roman and provincial was effectively erased. The emperor himself was now a Syrian, Trajan, and his successors could come from anywhere the legions were stationed. The far shores had truly become the heart of the empire. The empire had successfully evolved from a city-state ruling over subjects to a multi-ethnic state composed of citizens. I3. The limits of empire, frontiers, and the end of growth. While Rome was unprecedented in its ability to integrate conquered peoples, even the most formidable power had to recognize the ultimate limits of empire. The physical and logistical boundaries where the cost of conquest outweighed the gains.
The consolidation of the frontier. After the expansive reign of Trajan, his successor, Hadrian, AD 117 to 138, recognized a fundamental truth: endless conquest was unsustainable. He chose consolidation over expansion, security over glory. His policy was marked by the monumental erection of fortified frontiers. Hadrian's Wall in Britannia became the most famous physical symbol of this new policy. It was a clear, unyielding line separating the civilized Roman world from the untamed barbarians to the north. The Limes Germanicus in Europe was another such frontier, a fortified boundary of watchtowers and palisades protecting the provinces along the Rhine and Danube rivers. These frontiers were not impenetrable walls designed to stop all movement, but rather fortified zones designed to control trade, migration, and military incursions. They represented the geopolitical reality. Rome was no longer growing, it was defending. The geopolitical strain. The decision to consolidate marked the subtle beginning of the imperial system's great strain. Logistical overextension. Maintaining the 4,000-mile frontier required a massive standing army, about 400,000 men. This army was a colossal fixed expense, absorbing the majority of the empire's revenue. Cultural and economic shift. The wealth and culture of the empire increasingly flowed to the procure provinces, while the military focus shifted to the borders, weakening the connection between the princeps and the old Roman core. The best troops and generals were now provincials stationed far from Rome. The very success of Roman conquest, the massive territorial extent, and the inclusion of vast numbers of new citizens paradoxically laid the groundwork for future crisis. When the pressure on the frontiers intensified in the 3rd and 4th centuries, it was the logistical overextension, the enormous cost of defense, and the difficulty of centrally commanding such a vast space that ultimately proved too much, fragmenting the western half of the great enterprise. The legacy of the far shores remains an unparalleled tale of power, a civilization that conquered the world and then successfully offered the title of citizen to the vanquished, creating an empire not just of domination, but of voluntary shared identity, an identity that endured long after the political limits of empire had been breached. The 3rd century AD stands as a blood-soaked chasm in the history of the Roman Empire, a near-fatal collapse known simply as the crisis of the 3rd century. The period, beginning with the final failure of the Severan dynasty and concluding with the iron reforms of Diocletian, was a perfect storm where the once unshakable foundations of the empire, political stability, military discipline, and economic health, were simultaneously shattered. It was an era defined by anarchy at the highest level, a devastating plague in the heartland, and the brutal reality of the barracks emperors. The Severan legacy. Militarism and instability. The seeds of the crisis were sown in the preceding dynasty. The Severan dynasty, AD 193 to 235, was a response to the year of the five emperors and was explicitly military in its focus. Severus famously advised his sons, "Enrich the soldiers and scorn all other men." This maxim, while securing immediate loyalty, fundamentally altered the balance of power. The focus on the army's welfare was financed by a massive debasement of the Roman coinage. Silver content in the denarius, the backbone of the Roman economy, was drastically reduced, a policy that created a creeping inflation that would later spiral into hyperinflation. The Severan rule was often autocratic, but it was generally effective until the death of the last Severan emperor, Severus Alexander, in AD 235. A timid and indecisive young man, he was murdered by his own troops in Germania. His crime was not tyranny, but weakness, attempting to negotiate with Germanic tribes rather than fight them. His assassination was the signal for the military to claim the ultimate political prize. The legions, now accustomed to elevating and disposing of emperors based on pay and military prowess, crowned the general Gaius Julius Verus Maximus, known as Maximus Thraxus, or the Thracian. He was the first of the barracks emperors, a towering, uncultured soldier who never even visited Rome during his 3-year reign. The rule of the Senate and the illusion of the princeps as first citizen were dead. The Roman Empire was now a military dictatorship, ruled by the man who commanded the most loyal legions. 2. Anarchy, the vicious cycle of the barracks emperors. The half-century that followed the death of Severus Alexander was a dizzying, terrifying cascade of violence and political fragmentation. From AD 235 to 284, the empire saw at least 26 legitimate emperors, plus numerous usurpers, almost all of whom were military men. Most reigned for a few months or years, and nearly all met a violent end, usually at the hands of the very troops who had raised them to power.
1. Border collapse. Every civil war meant legions were pulled from the frontiers, the Danube, the Rhine, and the East, to march on Rome or fight a rival claimant. This left the borders dangerously exposed. 2. External invasion. Sensing weakness, Rome's neighbors launched coordinated aggressive assaults. The Goths and Alemanni breached the Danube and Rhine, ravaging Greece and Italy itself. In the east, the newly established powerful Sassanid Empire of Persia replaced the old Parthians and proved a formidable foe, routing Roman armies and even capturing the Emperor Valerian in AD 260, an unprecedented humiliation that permanently damaged Roman prestige. 3. Economic ruin. Each new emperor had to secure the loyalty of his troops by offering an enormous donative or bonus, requiring the minting of ever more debased coinage. A silver coin quickly became little more than a bronze wafer with a thin wash of silver. Hyperinflation destroyed trade, making it impossible for the government to collect reliable taxes or for merchants to conduct long-distance business. The urban economy, the pride of the Pax Romana, collapsed as cities shrank and wealthy landowners retreated to self-sufficient fortified estates, latifundia, severing the link between the central state and the local economy. The splintering empire. The anarchy became so profound that for a time the Roman Empire fractured into three competing states. The Gallic Empire, AD 260 to 274, which governed the western provinces of Gaul, Britain, and Spain, ruled by a succession of local generals. The Palmyrene Empire, AD 270 to 273, a strong eastern state based in Syria, led by the formidable Queen Zenobia, which briefly controlled Egypt and much of Asia Minor. The original Roman Empire, sandwiched in the middle. The great experiment of the Pax Romana had failed. The world's largest superpower had effectively ceased to be a unified state, unable to control its own territory. 3. Plague and climate, the wrath of the gods. If political chaos was not enough, the 3rd century was tormented by natural disaster. 2 major plagues swept the empire, most famously the plague of Cyprian, c. AD 250 to 270, named for the bishop of Carthage who documented its horrors. The true nature of the illness is unknown, likely a strain of smallpox or measles, but its effects were apocalyptic. Depopulation. Cities, already struggling from economic collapse, were decimated. Estimates of mortality rates range widely, but the plague hit the army, the most concentrated populations, with particular severity. Manpower shortages. The loss of life created a critical scarcity of manpower, both for the legions needed to guard the border and for the farms required to feed the remaining population. This led to vast stretches of previously cultivated land falling fallow, further crippling the economy. Spiritual and psychological impact. In an age where disaster was viewed as divine displeasure, the plague eroded public morale and faith in the traditional Roman gods. The state-sponsored persecution of Christians by emperors like Decius was a desperate attempt to restore cosmic order by forcing religious conformity, but it only added internal religious division to the existing political chaos. The combination of invasion, civil war, and epidemic created a deep, pervasive sense of crisis, a feeling that the universe itself had turned against Rome. The eternal city felt anything but. IV. The edge of the abyss and the return of order. The eventual survival of the Roman Empire was not inevitable. It was the result of a few extraordinary men who rose from the ranks of the barracks emperors themselves. These were the Illyrian emperors, tough, disciplined soldiers from the Balkan provinces who possessed the will and talent to fight back. Claudius Gothicus, AD 260 to 270, delivered a crushing defeat to the Goths who had been ravaging the Balkans. But the true savior was Aurelian, AD 270 to 275, known as Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. Aurelian reunited the shattered empire through furious campaigning. He defeated the Alemanni invading Italy, dismantled the Palmyrene Empire by capturing Queen Zenobia, and finally secured the submission of the Gallic Empire. He ruled with such terrifying efficiency that the vast political entity was once again whole. His final act in Rome, the construction of the enormous Aurelian walls around the capital, was a silent admission that the days of easily defended, distant frontiers were over. The heart of the empire now needed fortification. Though Aurelian himself was assassinated by his officers, his success paved the way for Diocletian, AD 284 to 305. Diocletian recognized that the old system was irreparably broken. He ended the crisis not by restoring the republic, but by formalizing the autocracy. He doubled the size of the civil service, instituted strict price and wage controls to fight inflation, persecuted Christians to enforce religious unity, and, most famously, established the Tetrarchy, dividing the empire into 4 administrative units to ensure rapid succession and better defense of the frontiers. The Suveran crisis had dragged the Roman world to its knees, destroying its economy, breaking its centralized government, and exposing it to existential threats. The era of the barracks emperors was a painful, bloody transition from the elegant principate of Augustus to the rigid, militarized dominant of late antiquity. Rome survived, but the classical world was forever changed, a testament to the resilience of its institutions, even as the memory of anarchy, plague, and failed emperors remained a terrifying lesson in the fragility of power. The crisis of the 3rd century had brought the Roman Empire to its knees, a half-century of anarchy where the imperial throne was a cheap prize for any general with a strong legion and a murderous ambition. When Diocles, a low-born soldier from Dalmatia, seized power in AD 284, he took the name Diocletian and embarked on a singular mission to restore the empire's stability, security, and solvency. His solution was a paradoxical, brutal, and revolutionary one. To rebuild the empire, he had to functionally tear it apart, abandoning centuries of Roman tradition in favor of total, centralized autocracy, the era of Diocletian's hard hand. 1. The end of the princeps, the dominatus. Diocletian was the final death knell for the illusion of the principate, the old fiction that the emperor was merely the first citizen. He replaced it with the dominatus, a military, autocratic monarchy where the emperor was dominus et deus, Lord and God. Imperial pomp and isolation. Diocletian understood that a key weakness of the barracks emperors was their accessibility and the lack of respect they commanded. He rectified this by adopting the elaborate court ceremonies of the Persian Sassanids. The purple veil. He abandoned the simple military tunic for silk robes embroidered with gold and jewels. He wore a diamond-studded diadem, a symbol of royalty previously alien to Roman tradition. Adoration, adoratio. Visitors to the imperial presence were now required to prostrate themselves and kiss the hem of his robe. This ritual, designed to elevate the emperor above the common mortal, was intended to insulate him from the casual familiarity that often preceded assassination. The emperor was no longer a general to be casually approached, but a remote, godlike figure. This transformation was not mere vanity, it was calculated political defense. By placing the emperor on a transcendent plane, Diocletian hoped to remove him from the reach of jealous officers and the whims of the legions. 2. The Tetrarchy, the hard logic of division. Diocletian's most revolutionary and successful political innovation was the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. He recognized the empire's massive size made it impossible for one man to govern and defend simultaneously. The crisis had proven that when the emperor rushed to one frontier, the others flared up, or a usurper rose in the rear. The 4 pillars. Diocletian divided the empire into halves, east and west, and appointed a collegium of 4 rulers. 2 Augusti, senior emperors. Diocletian took the east, with his capital at Nicomedia, near the vital Persian and Danube frontiers. He appointed his trusted military comrade, Maximian, as Augustus of the west, with his capital at Mediolanum, Milan, better positioned to defend the Rhine and Italy. 2 Caesares, junior emperors. Each Augustus adopted a younger man as his designated successor and junior partner. Galerius in the east, and Constantius Chlorus in the west. The Tetrarchy was a strategic, administrative, and military masterstroke that fundamentally tore apart the political unity of the empire in order to rebuild its stability. Decentralized defense. Now, 4 imperial courts, situated close to the most volatile borders, like Trier, Sirmium, and Nicomedia, not Rome, ensured immediate military response to any incursion. Mandatory succession. The Caesars were trained to be the next Augusti. The plan mandated that after a fixed period of rule, the 2 Augusti would abdicate and the Caesars would rise to take their places, simultaneously appointing 2 new Caesars. This was intended to solve the most enduring political weakness of the empire, the chaotic succession after an emperor's death. Diocletian's great act of faith in his system came in AD 305, when, remarkably, he voluntarily abdicated, forcing a reluctant Maximian to do the same. The first tetrarchy transitioned successfully, a moment of profound stability unheard of in a century. 3. The military administrative machine. To support the 4 imperial courts and their vast armies, Diocletian created the most centralized, pervasive, and expensive bureaucracy the empire had ever seen. Separation of powers. To prevent the rise of another barracks emperor, Diocletian systematically destroyed the power of provincial governors. He dynamically multiplied the number of provinces from about 50 to nearly 100, making them smaller and less powerful. He strictly separated civil and military authority. Governors, correctores, or presides could no longer command troops. Military commanders, duces or comites, held no civil power. This hard hand eliminated the single office power base a general needed to launch a successful usurpation. The new military apparatus. The army was enlarged and reformed, moving away from the old legionary structure. Border troops, limitanei, fixed garrisons stationed along the frontier, charged with routine defense and local intelligence. Field armies, comitatenei, elite forces positioned behind the frontiers. They could be deployed rapidly to any crisis point, a costly but essential strategic reserve that had been lacking during the crisis.
4. The economic shackles, capping the system. The constant stream of military demands required a stable economy, which the hyperinflation of the 3rd century had obliterated. Diocletian's economic reforms were ingenious, necessary, and ultimately tyrannical. The tax revolution, Iugationum capitationum. Diocletian replaced the shattered silver currency system with a tax based on real assets, a combined assessment of land and labor. Iugationum assessed the productivity of the land, the iugum or unit of land. Capitationum assessed the labor force attached to it, the caput or unit of head. Taxes were increasingly collected in kind, grain, oil, supplies, and clothing, and then redistributed to the nearest imperial court or army garrison. This tore apart the dependence on coinage, but it tied the rural populace directly to the state's massive consumption. Binding the citizen to the soil. To ensure the necessary supply of taxes and manpower, Diocletian issued edicts that bound people to their professions. Tenant farmers, coloni. These men, crucial for farming the land, were forbidden from leaving their estates. They and their descendants were permanently tied to the soil, a process that foreshadowed the serfdom of the Middle Ages. City councilors, curiales, the local wealthy elites, who had traditionally funded public works, were now responsible for personally collecting the imperial taxes from their communities and making up any shortfall out of their own pockets.
They became hereditary victims of the imperial machine, a class the rich sought desperately to escape. The Edict on Maximum Prices, AD 301. In a desperate attempt to combat inflation and price gouging, a major drain on military pay, Diocletian issued his most infamous decree, the Edict on Maximum Prices, set an absolute cap on the prices of over 1,000 goods and wages for nearly all professions, backed by the death penalty. It was an impossible imposition that failed spectacularly, causing goods to vanish from official markets, driving all trade into the black market, and further illustrating the hard hand of a state trying to centrally manage an economy too vast and complex.
The year AD 312 was not just a date on a Roman calendar. It was the hinge of history. For 3 centuries, Christianity had been a persecuted marginal faith, and illegal superstition that promised salvation but often delivered only the executioner's axe. Then came Constantine the Great, a military pragmatist, an ambitious general, and, as fate would have it, the agent of a divine revelation. His ascent to sole power forever linked the destiny of the Roman Empire to the creed of the despised cross, inaugurating the triumph of the cross, Constantine, and the rise of Christianity. Part 1. The Shadow of Persecution, Seeds of Faith. Constantine's life began under the shadow of the Tetrarchy, the system designed by Diocletian to stabilize the empire. Born around AD 272, his early years were spent as a hostage protege in the eastern court of Diocletian and Galerius, a witness to the final great wave of anti-Christian oppression, the Great Persecution. This persecution, AD 303 to 311, driven by the senior emperor Galerius, was a brutal, systematic attempt to wipe out the Christian faith. Churches were burned, scriptures seized, and thousands of believers tortured and executed. Yet instead of destroying the church, the persecution proved its strength. The unflinching courage of the martyrs served as a profound witness, fueling the faith's growth, particularly in the urban centers. Constantine's father, Constantius Chlorus, Augustus of the West, was notably unenthusiastic about the persecutions, applying the edicts lightly in his domain of Gaul and Britain. When Constantius died in York in AD 306, his troops immediately acclaimed him as the new Augustus, plunging the Tetrarchy into a civil war over succession. Constantine, a powerful general and a brilliant strategist, was initially a devotee of the solar deity Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, a popular syncretic religion fitting for an emperor. His religious journey, however, was about to take a shocking and permanent detour. Part 2. The Sign in the Sky, Milvian Bridge, AD 312. The road to becoming sole ruler of the West led Constantine to a climatic confrontation with his primary rival in Italy, Maxentius, the usurper who controlled Rome. Maxentius commanded a larger, better-fed army and waited securely inside Rome's formidable Aurelian walls. Constantine, marching from Gaul, faced a daunting challenge. The decisive clash occurred at the Milvian Bridge over the Tiber River, just north of Rome. The night before the battle, the traditional accounts, most famously from the Christian historian Eusebius, record a divine intervention. The vision. Constantine saw a vision in the sky, either a cross of light or the Chi Rho symbol, the first 2 Greek letters of Christ. Above it, he saw the inscription, In ho signo vinces, by this sign you will conquer. The dream. That night, Christ appeared to him in a dream, confirming the instruction, use this celestial sign as his military standard. Constantine obeyed. He ordered his men to paint the Chi Rho symbol onto their shields and had the symbol affixed to a new military standard, the labrum. It was an act of extraordinary risk, placing his army's fate in the hands of the god of a previously banned minority. The battle itself was a rout. Maxentius's forces, hemmed in by the Tiber, were crushed, and Maxentius himself drowned as his pontoon bridge collapsed. Constantine entered Rome in triumph,
attributing his victory not to Roman gods or martial prowess, but to the God of the Christians. The triumph of the cross was thus secured not by theology, but by military steel and divine intervention on the battlefield. Part 3. The Edict of Milan, Peace of the Church. Constantine's victory did not immediately make Christianity the state religion, but it secured its right to exist. In early AD 313, Constantine met with his remaining co-ruler in the east, Licinius, in Milan. The result of this meeting was the Edict of Milan, a watershed moment in religious history. This edict, which was actually a letter of policy sent to provincial governors, did two revolutionary things. 1. Religious tolerance. It granted unconditional religious liberty to Christians and all other religions throughout the empire. Persecution was officially and permanently ended. 2. Restitution. It ordered the immediate return of all confiscated Christian property, churches, cemeteries, and assets, which had been seized during the Great Persecution. The Edict of Milan marked the formal end of the 3-century conflict between the Roman Empire and Christianity. For the Church, it was the peace of the Church. For the Empire, it meant the end of a destructive internal conflict. Constantine began to actively favor the Christian Church, exempting clergy from municipal service, a huge financial benefit, funding the construction of grand basilicas like St. Peter's in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and donating tax revenue to the church.
4. The architect of the state church, unification and conflict. Constantine was not merely a tolerator. He was the first imperial patron of the church, and he viewed Christian unity as essential to the unity of the empire. This belief led to a new and unprecedented form of imperial intervention in spiritual affairs. The Donatist controversy, North Africa. Almost immediately after legalization, a schism arose in North Africa over the Donatists, who refused to recognize clergy who had surrendered sacred texts, traditores, during the Diocletian persecution. Constantine, seeking to resolve the dispute, called church councils in Rome and Arles. When the Donatists refused to accept the decisions, Constantine, frustrated by their defiance, used imperial power against them, ironically launching the first persecution of Christians by a Christian-friendly emperor. He demanded theological and ecclesiastical unity for the sake of imperial stability. The Arian Crisis and the Council of Nicaea, AD 225. The most profound threat to Christian unity was the Arian controversy, a theological dispute over the nature of Christ. Arius, a priest in Alexandria, argued that Christ was a created being subordinate to God the Father. This threatened to fracture the Christian world. By AD 224, Constantine had defeated Licinius and become the sole Augustus of a reunited empire. He found the eastern provinces ablaze with Arianism. Seeing this division as a political danger, he acted as the external bishop of the church. The First Ecumenical Council. Constantine convened the First Council of Nicaea in AD 225. He personally presided over the proceedings, clad in imperial purple. It was an extraordinary spectacle, the secular ruler of the Roman world mediating the nature of God. The Nicene Creed, guided by Constantine's desire for unity, decisively condemned Arianism. The result was the formulation of the Nicene Creed, which affirmed Christ's status as homoousios, or of the same substance as the Father. This established the foundational doctrine of Orthodox Christianity, enforced by imperial decree. Constantine had successfully engineered the shift from a persecuted religion to a defined, politically essential, state-supported institution. 5. A new Rome, Constantinople. Constantine's final, monumental act was to abandon the city of Rome as the administrative heart of the empire and establish a new Christian capital. In AD 330, the city of Byzantium, strategically located on the Bosporus Strait between Europe and Asia, was rededicated as Constantinople, Nova Roma, New Rome. Strategic necessity. The site was superior to Rome for defending the vulnerable Danube and Persian frontiers and for commanding the rich resources of the eastern provinces. Christian identity. The city was designed as a Christian capital, free from the pagan temples and senatorial aristocracy that still dominated Rome. Though pagan monuments existed, its most famous structures were brand churches. Constantinople became the center of the Christian, Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, a power that would endure for another 1,000 years. Constantine ruled for over 30 years, though he famously executed his own son Crispus and his wife Fausta, exhibiting the brutal pragmatism of his predecessors. He was unwavering in his patronage of the Church. He was baptized on his deathbed in AD 337, a final public commitment to the faith he had raised from the catacombs to the throne. The triumph of the cross under Constantine was a complex reality, a fusion of divine miracle, military necessity, political calculation, and ruthless pragmatism. It marked the moment the great river of Roman imperial power decisively flowed into the channel of Christian faith, creating the framework for medieval Europe and beyond, a legacy born from a vision seen on the eve of a battle. The air above the eternal city, even in the early 4th century, seemed to possess a timeless arrogance. Rome had stood unconquered, inviolate for nearly 800 years, a physical and psychological fortress that defined civilization. Yet by AD 410, that arrogance was brittle, and the walls of the West were crumbling under the weight of fear, incompetence, and the unstoppable pressure of the barbarian shadow. The world was about to witness the impossible. Rome sacked. First, the earthquake from the east, Adrianople, AD 378. The crisis did not begin with the Goths, but with the Huns, nomadic horse archers who burst from the Central Asian steppes. Their terrifying efficiency shattered the settled Gothic tribes, the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, living north of the Danube, driving them in a desperate flood toward the imperial frontier. The Danube crossing. In AD 76, tens of thousands of Visigoths begged the Eastern Emperor Valens for asylum, offering military service in exchange for safe settlement inside the empire. Valens, driven by a blend of military greed and political necessity, agreed, but the Roman officials overseeing the crossing were corrupt and cruel. Starving and abusing the Goths, the refugees revolted. The Battle of Adrianople. The conflict culminated 2 years later at the Battle of Adrianople, AD 378. Valens, overconfident and impatient, rushed his legions against the Gothic forces led by Fritigern before the Western army could arrive. The ensuing slaughter was the worst military disaster since Cannae. The Gothic heavy cavalry shattered the Roman infantry. Emperor Valens himself was killed. Adrianople was not just a defeat, it was a psychological fracture. It proved that the Roman army was no longer invincible, and that a barbarian force could not only defeat a major Roman army, but kill an emperor. The barbarian shadow had fallen directly upon the heart of the empire. Second, the strongman and the shadow emperor. The empire temporarily stabilized under Theodosius the Great, who masterfully pacified the Goths by settling them inside the Balkans as a semi-autonomous foederati, allies. This policy, however, ensured that a massive, well-armed Gothic nation existed within Roman territory. When Theodosius died in AD 395, the empire was permanently divided between his two weak sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. Honorius, a notoriously inept and cowardly ruler, retreated to the safety of the virtually impenetrable fortress city of Ravenna. This left the actual governance and military defense of the West to a series of powerful magistre militum, masters of soldiers, chief among them the Vandal general Flavius Stilicho. Stilicho's dilemma. Stilicho was the last great Roman general of the West, constantly battling to keep the frontiers intact. His primary adversary was Alaric, the brilliant, ambitious king of the Visigoths. Alaric was not simply a raider. He wanted a fixed, recognized homeland for his people and a high office in the Roman military hierarchy. The relationship between Stilicho and Alaric was a tightrope walk, a necessary alliance constantly threatening to collapse into war. Their fragile peace was repeatedly undermined by the paranoid, anti-foreigner elite in Ravenna, who could not comprehend the necessity of cooperating with a barbarian. The River of Ice, AD 406. The situation became untenable in AD 406. Pressed by the Huns, a huge, desperate coalition of Germanic tribes, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, found the Rhine River frozen solid. They poured across the frontier, sweeping through Gaul and eventually into Spain. This massive, unchecked movement marked the definitive loss of Roman control over the northwestern provinces. In the midst of this chaos, Stilicho was falsely accused of treason by his enemies at Honorius's court. In AD 08, the weak Emperor Honorius ordered Stilicho's execution. This act was an unforgivable strategic blunder. It decapitated the Western army, removing the one man capable of matching Alaric. It also triggered a massive anti-barbarian purge, causing thousands of foederati soldiers to abandon their posts and join the ranks of Alaric.
The siege and the sacrifice. With Stilicho gone, the walls protecting Italy dissolved. Alaric, denied the concessions he sought and infuriated by the murder of the general he respected, marched his Visigoths across the Alps. His target was not Ravenna, but the vast, symbolic prize, Rome. Rome was no longer the political capital, but it was still the eternal city and the spiritual heart of the Senate and the old Roman aristocracy. It housed roughly 800,000 citizens. The first and second sieges, AD 408 to 409. Alaric did not assault the Aurelian walls directly. Instead, he lay siege, cutting off the city's vital grain supply from North Africa via the port of Ostia. The city quickly descended into starvation and plague. The panic was so intense that the Senate briefly contemplated restoring pagan sacrifices to the old gods, believing Christianity had brought ruin, a sign of the deep moral and religious schism. The Senate eventually capitulated, paying Alaric an astronomical ransom of 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, and vast quantities of luxury goods. The Goths withdrew, but the victory was purely financial. When Emperor Honorius in Ravenna still refused to grant Alaric a permanent settlement, the Visigoth king returned for a second siege, briefly setting up a rival puppet emperor to leverage his demands. 4. The walls are breached, August 24th, AD 1010. The culmination of 8 decades of internal weakness, military mismanagement, and barbarian pressure came in the late summer of AD 1010. Alaric, negotiating for the third time, was rebuffed with Honorius's typical arrogance. Frustrated and determined, he marched on Rome one final time. On the night of August 24th, 410 AD,
the impossible happened. According to contemporary accounts, the Porta Salaria, or Salarian Gate, was quietly opened from within, either by disaffected, starving slaves seeking vengeance on their masters, or by Gothic spies. The Visigoths poured into the sleeping city. The 3-day pillage. For 3 days the Goths plundered Rome. The scale. The sack was traumatic, but historians agree it was not the destructive firestorm often depicted in later Romantic art. Alaric, an Arian Christian, commanded his men to respect the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul as sanctuaries and to spare the lives of those who took refuge there. The main targets were the palaces of the rich aristocracy, who had stored vast personal wealth. Gold, silver, furniture, and magnificent statues were seized. The greatest victims were the civilian population, subjected to terror, rape, and enslavement. The barbarian shadow had breached the physical walls and now engulfed the Roman people. The psychological shock. The physical damage was repairable, but the psychological impact was immeasurable. For the first time since the Gauls in 387 BC, the heart of the Western world had been conquered. The news stunned the empire. St. Jerome, living in Bethlehem, famously lamented, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." The myth of Rome's invincibility was irrevocably shattered. The aftermath. The walls collapse. Alaric withdrew after 3 days and died soon after in southern Italy. His successor, Ataulf, took the Goths west, eventually settling them in Gaul and Spain. The sack of 410 did not end the Western Roman Empire. That death came 66 years later in AD 476, but it marked its decisive, inescapable decline. The event validated the barbarian shadow. The Goths now knew they could conquer any part of the West. Other tribes, like the Vandals, emboldened, crossed from Spain into North Africa, the crucial grain basket for Rome, in AD 429. Decimated Roman finances. The loss of tax revenue from Britain, Gaul, Spain, and later Africa starved the imperial treasury, making it impossible to pay the armies needed for defense. Shifted the intellectual focus. Christian thinkers like St. Augustine were forced to confront the disaster. He began writing City of God, arguing that the fall of the earthly Rome was secondary to the salvation of the eternal city of God, thus pivoting the intellectual focus of the West away from the secular empire. The Western Empire spent its final decades as a ghost, controlled by rotating generals, many of them barbarian, fighting a feudal rearguard action. The walls of the West did not fall in a single crash. They eroded over a long century, culminating in the sack of 410, a moment that revealed the hollowness at the heart of the once eternal city. For more on the circumstances surrounding the great military disaster that foreshadowed the sack of Rome, you can watch Battle of Adrianople, Early World Civilizations. 1. The Kingmaker, Ricimer, and the Puppet Emperors. Following the death of the great general Aetius, who had defeated Attila the Hun, and the assassination of Emperor Valentinian III in AD 455, a brutal power vacuum engulfed Italy. The true authority was no longer vested in the emperor, but in the commander of the army, a position known as Magister Militum, Master of Soldiers. For 16 critical years, this role was held by Flavius Ricimer. Ricimer, born of Suebi and Visigothic royalty, was a barbarian who had reached the pinnacle of Roman military power. He was not an emperor, but he was the kingmaker. The emperors he placed on the throne were his puppets, men of limited ability, whom he could control or discard at will. The rise and fall of Majorian, AD 457 to 461. Ricimer's one brief miscalculation was Majorian, a competent general who showed a genuine desire to restore the empire. He was the last man to make a credible attempt at restoration. He was a reformer and a campaigner. He halted abuses in the tax system and protected the provincial populations. He launched successful campaigns in Gaul and Hispania, restoring some order to the fragmented provinces. Crucially, he built a massive fleet in Spain, 300 ships, to launch a decisive invasion against the Vandals in North Africa, the empire's grain basket and key financial loss. However, the Vandal king Gaiseric, fearing Majorian's intent, launched a preemptive strike, destroying the fleet at anchor in Spain. Majorian, defeated but undaunted, returned to Italy where Ricimer saw his opportunity. A competent emperor was a threat to the kingmaker's power. Ricimer captured Majorian, tortured him, and had him executed in AD 61. The last hope for a genuine revival of the West died with him. The decades of puppets. Ricimer spent the next decade installing and disposing of emperors like minor officials. Libius Severus, AD 461 to 465. Installed by Ricimer, unrecognized by the Eastern Empire. Anthemius, AD 477 to 472. A joint choice with the Eastern Emperor Leo I. This emperor was a last attempt at East-West cooperation. He planned a massive joint expedition against the Vandals, but the effort was an epic, costly failure. Anthemius's growing independence led Ricimer to besiege Rome, kill Anthemius, and elevate his next puppet. Olibri, AD 472, ruled for only a few months before dying naturally. Ricimer himself followed shortly after, dying in August AD 472. Ricimer's legacy was the systematic destruction of the imperial office. By proving that the emperor was a disposable figurehead, he extinguished any remaining prestige or loyalty to the crown.
2. The last general, Orestes, and the final collapse. The role of kingmaker was briefly held by Ricimer's nephew, Gundobad, a Burgundian, who eventually left Italy to consolidate his own power base. By AD 475, the real power in Italy was wielded by Flavius Orestes, a Roman patrician from Pannonia who had once served as a secretary to Attila the Hun. Orestes was a Roman aristocrat, but his army was entirely composed of Germanic foederati, federated troops, Heruli, Scyrian, and Turculingine mercenaries who had settled in Italy and formed the empire's final, exhausted defense force. The final usurpation. In AD 475, Orestes chased the sitting emperor, Julius Nepos, out of Italy and installed his own son on the throne. To lend a sense of tradition to this final desperate move, he chose a name steeped in Roman history. Romulus, after Rome's legendary founder. Augustus, after the first emperor. The boy, however, was only about 14 years old and was mockingly called Romulus Augustulus, Romulus, the little emperor. This final imperial title was not a statement of authority, but a tragic joke, signifying the small, fading dignity of the crown. The fatal refusal. Orestes' brief reign was one of fatal miscalculation. The Germanic mercenaries who formed his army and had put him in power demanded what their brethren had long acquired elsewhere, land in Italy to settle. Orestes, a Roman aristocrat, feared the political backlash and refused to grant his soldiers the land they demanded. He had committed the error that had brought down so many others, alienating the only force capable of defending him. 3. The end of the empire. Odoacer and the deposition, AD 476. The dissatisfied foederati army quickly found a new leader, Odoacer,
a tall, imposing Germanic chieftain, likely of Scyrian or Heruli descent, who was an officer in the Roman army. Odoacer promised them the land Orestes had denied. The final march. In August AD 476, Odoacer's barbarian troops revolted, quickly hunting down Orestes, who fled to Pavia. Orestes was captured and summarily executed on August 28, AD 476. Odoacer then marched on the imperial capital of Ravenna. On September 4th, AD 476, the small, powerless Romulus Augustulus was captured and deposed. The whimper, not the bang. The act was swift and shockingly understated. Odoacer did not declare himself emperor. He understood the toxic nature of the title in the West. Instead, he forced the boy emperor to perform his final official act, send the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple robes, and the insignia of the Western Empire, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. The message to Zeno, delivered by the Roman Senate, was clear and pragmatic. 1. The West no longer needed its own separate emperor. 2. The Roman Empire should be considered reunited under a single emperor in the East. 3. They proposed that Odoacer, with the title of patrician, a Roman honor, granted by Zeno, should govern Italy as his representative. Odoacer then proclaimed himself king or rex of Italy. The Western Roman Empire, founded by Augustus, did not fall to a conquest. It was unceremoniously dissolved by its own mercenary commander. The little emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was spared and pensioned off to live in luxury near Naples, a pathetic retirement for the symbol of a 1,200-year history. 4. Fading glory and the dawn of a new world. The events of AD 476 were barely noticed by contemporaries outside Italy. Most of the provinces, Britain, Gaul, Spain, and Africa, had already been lost to barbarian kingdoms, Visigoths, Vandals, and Franks, decades earlier. The last legion had long since been disbanded, merged, or settled as farmers. The true significance of 476 was not a physical fall, but a political one. It was the final, formal removal of the imperial title in the West. The end of a line. The legal fiction of a unified Roman Empire in the West was over. The barbarian reign. Italy was now governed openly by a barbarian king. This new political reality, Germanic kingdoms ruling Roman lands and populations, became the foundation of the medieval world. The Byzantine legacy. The Eastern Roman Empire, later Byzantium, with its capital in Constantinople, continued to flourish for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, Greek philosophy, and the Christian faith. It was the legitimate heir, carrying the Roman flame forward. The last emperors of the West were not powerful figures leading glorious legions. They were brief, frightened, and ultimately disposable puppets. Their fate was a quiet testament to the fact that the fading glory had not been killed by a sudden blow, but had simply withered away from within, leaving behind only the ghost of a name. 1. The Eastern Phoenix rises, AD 476 to 527. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 did not signify the end of the Roman Empire, but the end of the Western imperial line. The Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, Zeno, formally inherited the entire Roman world. His half of the empire, centered on the magnificent city of Constantinople, was richer, more stable, and more populous. Consolidating the East. While the West fractured into barbarian kingdoms, the East, which historians now often call the Byzantine Empire, was characterized by continuity. Imperial authority, The emperor remained the supreme authority, seen as God's vice-regent on earth. Economic strength. Control over the trade routes from Asia and the productive farmlands of Egypt and Anatolia ensured a steady stream of tax revenue. The Theodosian walls. Constantinople's massive fortifications kept the city safe from invasion, allowing the Phoenix to flourish while the West burned. The Ostrogothic interlude. Zeno accepted Odoacer's rule in Italy, granting him the title of patrician. However, this arrangement was always tentative. By AD 488, Zeno had grown tired of Odoacer's independence and dispatched a new Germanic tribe to challenge him, the Ostrogoths, led by their brilliant king Theodoric the Great. Theodoric invaded Italy, defeated and killed Odoacer, and established the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy. Theodoric, ruling from Ravenna, saw himself as a Roman sovereign. He preserved the Senate, maintained Roman law and administration, and ruled over Goths, Arian Christians, and Romans, Nicene Christians, with a degree of religious tolerance. For 3 decades, this kingdom offered a fragile, peaceful stability, the first successful synthesis of barbarian rule and Roman culture on Italian soil. The last Roman ambition, Justinian's Renovatio Imperii. The peace of the Ostrogothic kingdom was shattered by the monumental ambition of Emperor Justinian I, reigned AD 527 to 565. Justinian, a fierce and tireless administrator, believed it was his divine duty to realize the dream of Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the empire to its former glory. The first strike, Vandal Africa, AD 533 to 534. Justinian's first target was North Africa, held by the Arian Vandal kingdom. He dispatched his greatest general, Flavius Belisarius, with a small but elite force. The campaign was an astonishing, swift success. The Vandal kingdom was annihilated, and the crucial grain provinces of Africa, lost a century earlier, were restored to imperial control. This victory proved the feasibility of the Renovatio. The Gothic Wars, AD 535 to 554. Encouraged by success, Justinian turned his gaze to the heartland, Italy. Using a dynastic dispute in the Gothic court as an excuse, he ordered Belisarius to invade. This was the start of the catastrophic Gothic Wars, a 20-year conflict that ravaged the Italian peninsula and permanently destroyed the social, economic, and political structure of the West. Initial conquest. Belisarius marched north, capturing Naples and sensationally Rome itself in AD 536. The Goths rallied, besieging Belisarius in Rome for a year. The city's famed aqueducts were deliberately cut by the Goths, never to be fully restored, a definitive physical break with its ancient past. Gothic revival. Despite Belisarius's early success, the war dragged on, especially after the Goths found a new charismatic leader in King Totila. Totila retook Rome, sacking it and even briefly forcing its inhabitants out, leaving it a temporary ghost city. The final act. The war was finally won by a massive Byzantine invasion force led by the eunuch general Narses. The Goths were utterly defeated in AD 552, and by 554, the entire peninsula was technically back under Roman, or Byzantine rule. 3. Rome's enduring ghost. Justinian's victory was a Pyrrhic one for Italy. The Gothic wars left the peninsula utterly exhausted and depopulated. The physical city. The city of Rome, once a megalopolis of nearly 1 million people, was reduced to a war-torn settlement of possibly 30,000 to 50,000 people. Its grand imperial monuments lay derelict, the forums and temples becoming quarries for new constructions. The Senate, which had endured for a millennium, essentially ceased to function after the mid-6th century. Rome was no longer a metropolis. It was a ghost of its former self, a Byzantine provincial capital ruled by an official called the Exarch from Ravenna. The rise of the papacy. As imperial power in Italy was weakened by the endless wars, a new, uniquely Roman authority filled the void, the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope. The Church, with its established administrative structure, was the only institution that survived the chaos intact. Figures like Pope Gregory the Great, reigned AD 590 to 604, stepped into the role of civic administrator, distributing food, negotiating peace with invading forces like the Lombards, who arrived in 568, and organizing the city's defense. This pragmatic leadership cemented the Pope's authority not just as the spiritual leader of the West, but as the de facto political ruler of Rome. The enduring ghost of the Roman power structure had found a new vessel. The true legacy. While the Western political structure died, the Roman concept of law, governance, and civilization survived. Justinian's Code. The emperor's greatest contribution was the Corpus Juris Civilis, Code of Civil Law, a comprehensive compilation of all Roman law. Though created in the East, this code would be rediscovered in the West centuries later, forming the foundation of modern European civil law. The idea of Rome. The barbarian kings who replaced the emperors, Franks, Visigoths, and Ostrogoths, did not seek to destroy Rome, but to inherit its prestige. They adopted Roman titles, administration, and law, seeing themselves as successors, not destroyers. The Eastern Phoenix maintained the Roman Empire for another 1,000 years, but the enduring ghost of Rome, embodied in its language, its church, the papacy, and its law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, would shape the trajectory of Western Europe and the world far more profoundly than the fleeting reign of any last emperor.